Here we are. Hope everyone is doing well. Happy CVI Literacy Awareness Month. April is CVI Literacy Awareness Month, so definitely check out CVI Now for some upcoming articles and stories. And a huge part of literacy and helping our children become readers, writers, and problem solvers is making sure that they are in the right educational program and they have access to the right services. And a big part of that then is navigating the IEP process. So here we go. Welcome everyone to CVI Now's live virtual event, all about navigating the IEP process and advocating for your child's needs. If you're with us on our CVI Now parent group, drop a hello in the comments and feel free to post questions as they come to you. I am Rachel Bennett, the Content and Community Manager for CVI Now here at Perkins, and I'm a CVI mom to Henry. So CVI parents have to do a lot of hard things raising our child in a society that is just not accessible. There is a lot of uncertainty and stress and grief and pain and exhaustion. We have a lot to figure out for our kids. We want them to thrive, be happy, find their joy and potential. But one of the hardest things that we have to do is navigate the IEP process. We want schools and educational teams who understand the primacy of parents and who want to figure out alongside us how to best teach our child. Our kids have a right to effective and accessible educational programs. Unfortunately, there are still a lot of barriers on our CVI journey, including access to comprehensive assessment and data-driven IEPs, and difficulty finding TVIs and O&Ms and other educators and providers with comprehensive knowledge about CVI. So this is why I'm really excited about our expert today. Angela Gowans is an educational advocate who's worked with many families with children with CVI. Since 2005, Angela has worked as an advocate for families with children with disabilities. Over the last 15 years, Angela has worked to lobby for educational and healthcare legislation. She uses her extensive background in special education law, political lobbying, political negotiating, and communications to help families access services and education. Angela will discuss the IEP process, advice and tools for advocacy, and answer your questions. So let's get started. Welcome, Angela. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And I know you have some slides to get up.
Hey, Rachel, I wanted to say thank you. I really appreciate, I love talking about special education. I mean, that sounds a little weird, right? Like talking about special education, but I love problem solving. And I feel like this is an area that is all about problem solving, right? There isn't a guidebook that says, go do this, do this, do this, do this, and then this will happen. So constantly what I'm doing is problem solving with the families that I work with. So a lot of what I'm going to present today is just really an overview so that it will spark questions. And I really appreciate any questions you folks may have, Rachel, you might have, or other folks that are watching today. So I just want to make sure that we understand the level playing field, and then we go from there. So you want me to share my screen?
Yeah.
Okay. Cool. Let's see if this can happen in a way that you see what I want you to see. All right, here we go.
Yeah, share that moment.
Do you see it?
I see it.
Okay, so how to navigate the special education process. Special education, and it's a process. I always say that it is a process. There isn't anything that is really clear cut in special education. A lot of gray area, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. Let's see if I can move my slide. Okay, so what governs, so just so everyone knows, what governs us is IDEA, which is federal law, and it was established, well, originally it was called something else. It was called Education for Handicapped Children in 1990, and that was also previous before that, but then in 1990 it was changed to IDEA. In 2004 was the last time that was reauthorized, which is a really long time ago, and it's been up for reauthorization for a very long time. And that's like a whole nother situation. But right now, this is the law that guides us, is the 2004 law. And then states have their own special education law that guides us also. So we're guided in my work by federal law, state law. So every state has their own interpretation. And then also we are guided by state due process hearing decisions, federal decisions, or Supreme Court decisions. So all those avenues govern what we do. And then as advocates, as parents, that's what it's like the playing field we have. But also within that, there's administrative letters that come out that explain certain parts of the law or how it's interpreted through the Department of Education, either federally or locally. So there's a lot of different gray areas, what I explained earlier, that can really trip up families and sometimes advocates. So just so everyone knows the special education lingo, it's pretty, you might already have this already under your belt, but if you don't, I remember my first IEP meeting for my oldest son, and I was like, what is an SLP? I have no idea what this is. What's an OT? And I tell parents to like ask if you don't understand, but here are a few common ones. You know, the law that I just explained, IDEA, is really based on two principles of free, appropriate public education. So whether that is in a public school or in a private school or in a semi-private public situation, every child under special education is entitled is the key word, to a free, appropriate public education. The other acronym that everyone knows also is the least LRE, which is least restrictive environment. And I know that there were some questions submitted around that, so we'll talk about that later. No Child Left Behind is legislation that we're still, tackling in general education, we're still governed by. And that's like less special ed and more general ed, but it's definitely something that comes up. IEP is individualized education plan or program, depends on your state or how it's interpreted, sometimes even just school districts. LEA is your local educational agency, which is really your district, whether it's countywide or citywide. That is the person that makes educational decisions on behalf of your student. Now, every IEP must include an LEA. We'll talk a little bit about that, like whether that is actually a decision maker or not. It's supposed to be, but a lot of things that are in the law don't often happen. An evaluation planning team, EPT, that is comprised of the folks, parents, the folks that are testing, the child, general education teacher, special educator, could really be anyone that's testing and developing a plan for testing. SLP is speech language pathologist, OT is an occupational therapist, PT, physical therapist, AP, adaptive physical education, and ESY is extended school year. So that's outside of the regular school year and usually has different criteria depending on each state. I also like to put in here what a unilateral placement is. Parents have every right under federal law to place their child at a private placement with their own funds and seek reimbursement from the district, the school district, or the LEA. I'm going to just refer to it as the district because that's really the funding source. So we can talk more about that, but that's really important right that you have, is that you can place your child at an independent private school. Oftentimes it's a specialized school more often, and seek reimbursement from the district. So qualifying for special ed, I just wanted to go through this. You've probably all been through this process. You have a referral, whether it's from you or early intervention or from a teacher, go through the evaluation process. You have eligibility, whether or not the student has a suspected disability. So you don't have to have that piece of paper that says they have a disability from like a doctor or a neuropsychologist or another outside private professional. What the law requires is that there's a suspected disability. And then that's gate one. And then gate two is does the student require special education or specialized instruction outside of general ed? So that's the second gate, which sometimes can be a little bit hard to get through. Then there's the IEP process, and we'll go right into that next. And then there's placement. So the IEP is actually separate from the placement, and oftentimes people want to talk about placement right up here, like before the IEP, but placement happens after the IEP. And then the instruction, and every year the IEP team, unless you agree as parents, reconvenes at least yearly. You as parents can call an IEP team meeting at any point, but you're supposed to review every year. And that review is supposed to then generate new goals, look at progress, new current performance, and we'll go through that next. So we just wanted to talk about assessments and evaluations, because oftentimes people come to me and they'll say, I asked the teacher for this kind of assessment, or I asked the teacher for this kind of evaluation, and it was verbal and it never got done, or your consent was never sent to you. So I always ask for assessments and evaluations in writing. In writing is important because if it's not done, we want to make sure that the parents I work with, we want to make sure we go back to that. So we asked for the time frame of the assessments, especially this time of year, because we are running out of the 30-day assessment period, depending on your school district, depending on your school year. So is it going to be done this year, or will it be pushed to the following year? And I always request the assessments prior to the meeting. Now, some states don't require. Here in Massachusetts, it's required that all parents that request the assessment reports get them 48 hours prior to the meeting, so 2 days prior to the meeting. However, some states don't have that written to their state law. It's very unfortunate, and sometimes school districts don't give you the reports prior. I always kind of make a stink in this area. I always kind of say, we can't participate in the meeting unless we read the reports prior to the meeting. Some districts care and some districts don't, but I would always request in writing. And then you want to make your request for evaluations clear, like what areas are you really looking at? Are you looking at social skills? Are you looking at speech and language? Are you looking at CVI? I know that all of you have students or children with CVI. So make it very clear what you're looking for. And make sure you request a meeting. They're required to meet with you 15 days after, so that 30-day period, and then the 15 days after that 30-day period to review. But this year in particular, putting requests in writing because so many things are getting lost in the shuffle of COVID and kids being virtual and in person and hybrid. I would put everything in writing and just make sure that folks follow up with you. I talked about this already, but this is really the identifying, does the child need specialized instruction? That's where a lot of folks get tripped up. And so kids with higher cognitive abilities, this could be like, they don't need specialized instruction. So really, there's a perception from general ed or the district that they don't need specialized instruction. But this is really an area, especially in CVI, they do need specialized instruction. I want to talk about outside evaluations because you may be seeking them either publicly funded or your private pay. Depending on your state, there's different state rules of whether public funding is available to you. Here in Massachusetts, we don't have really robust state laws around public funded outside evaluations or private evaluations. So it really depends on your state. But you want to choose someone qualified with the correct background and experience. You want, if you have a kiddo with vision impairment, whether it's ocular or CVI or both, you want to make sure that evaluator, even if they're doing cognitive evaluation or academic evaluation, that they have some experience or they know how to accommodate your child. I want to be very careful, like in this area, because especially kids with vision impairment, I find that folks that do outside and private evaluations, really sometimes they are not qualified to do the evaluation, even if it's not like a CVI range. It's really, if it's about like a cognition test, there really needs to be some accommodations made to that test, and most providers don't necessarily know how to do that. So have some good conversations with the evaluator to make sure they're appropriate. Make sure you sign the consent forms. This is another area that people have that have some issues with not signing consent forms. So home and school and medical information isn't shared with the evaluator. We want to look like we're being completely transparent as parents and making sure the evaluator has all the information that they have in order to make proper diagnoses and recommendations. Ask the examiner about their timeline to getting you a report, because this is can be a real problem. If someone takes, 3 to 6 months to write a report, that's really, that report is going to be outdated. Like how long does it take you to write a report? So these are lengthy evaluations often and really comprehensive, and it takes a while, but I look for 4 to 6 weeks after the testing is finished as an appropriate timeline, but there's definitely folks that can take a little bit longer. Ask the evaluator if you can see the report before you release it to the school. Some will, some won't, depending if it's publicly funded, probably not. If it's privately funded, I would push this. You want to make sure everything is accurate in there. Even the best evaluators that I work with, I'm always doing a couple, run-throughs. Maybe something sounds confusing. I might say, hey, page 20, paragraph 2, the last sentence doesn't make any sense. Or, parents looking at the information, make sure it's all accurate, because this will follow your student for a very long time, and it's really important that it's accurate. And then finally, share the findings with your school district, meaning sharing that final report, your school district, and making sure that they review it and review the recommendations. By law, that's all they have to do. They do not have to take the recommendations and agree with them, but it's really a good opportunity to say, why don't you agree with this? Like, why don't you agree with these recommendations? What do you see that's different? Really some understanding of their perspective and understanding if they don't agree with something. Okay, so we're going to get right into the IEP. Okay, I think a little bit, let me give you my little tidbit of advice is staying organized is super important. This process is not for the faint of heart. And I know that all of you probably have been in a lot of IEP meetings. I think staying organized is really, really important. Whether it's your paperwork, whether it's your evaluations, you have a file on your desktop just for those or just for the school year. That's really important so you can easily access the information you need. And follow the process. Like I said before, like sometimes school folks or parents want to talk about placement before even a IEP is developed. Like there is a process for a reason. And if we follow the process, then we usually not always get the result we want, but we get a result, you know. So it can be disorganized. I've been in a lot of IEP meetings where we're just talking in circles and we're not really talking about needs, and we're not really talking about IEP goals, and we're really not talking about services. We just talk about like this problem. And if we go back to the IEP and the organization of the IEP, whether or not you're in Florida, Texas, Vermont, Massachusetts, wherever you are, there's a process to the IEP. And if you're just looking at the IEP and you're thinking, okay, this IEP starts with the student strengths. It starts then with the student needs. Then you can stay organized and you can make sure you get through all the pieces you need to get through. All right. What's the starting point in an IEP? Well, we want to talk about strengths, definitely, but really you're there to talk about what the education, the specialized education your child needs. So yes, it's very good to have the strengths. It's very good. Everyone thinks that, you know, children are amazing, but let's talk about the needs of the child, because that's really what we want to use the time for. We don't want to, you know, waste 2 hours talking about how great its kid is, and then we leave and we don't have it written down what their needs are and then how their needs are going to be met in the school district. So this is really important. I think, what's the starting point? What's the present levels of performance? This I think is a really, really important place. I always say to my clients, if we don't know where we're starting, we don't know where we're going to end up. So if we don't have an accurate present levels of each area of concern, so those areas could be academics, reading, writing, math. You know, so you could have 3 goals in 3 different areas. Could be communication, could be vision, could be orientation and mobility. It could be PT and OT. Every category or every goal needs to have a present level of performance, because if we don't know where our child's at, we don't know where they're going to be at in the future, and then that goal is really not useful. So we want to make sure it identifies the needs of the child. If a present level doesn't identify where they're at and identify the needs, then we can't write a goal. Oh, wait. Oh, yeah. Oh, this is an example of a current performance for CVI. I just want to make sure that folks saw an example of what this student is in phase 2. Current performance was based on evaluation report, clinical observation over the previous IEP period, and it talks about where the child's at right then when this was written. This gives us a good basis of where, like, we don't want, oftentimes I get IEPs from new clients and I look and I'm like, well, I don't even know if the child's made progress because I don't know where they started in their last IEP. So we want to make this is really one of the important pieces. I'll just leave this up for a second. This could be another example of current performance, CVI, and Ocular. This student has both. And the previous one did not. And we want to make sure that this is another example of how it was written. I do not write the current performances. I would also not exactly encourage you to physically write the current performances because you're not in the classroom every day. You may be doing remote with your student now, so you may have more input in this, but it really comes from the providers that are in the classroom providing the service for that particular goal area. You may have suggestions or input, and I would tell you to make sure you voice your input. You don't want to do the writing or the wordsmithing of this because you want to make sure it's really owned by the school team. Okay, so goal areas, needs. So it's really important to know what the needs are because they drive the IEP goals. If we don't know what the needs are, then we don't have goal areas. This is hugely important. And you'll see why. Because goals drive services. If you don't know what your needs are, then you do not know what your goals are. And then you do not know what your services are. And then you don't know what they should look like. And are they provided? Who's the provider? Who's providing it? Making sure that's really accurate. Some areas that I see that are red flags for me in an IEP is if services are provided by a paraprofessional directly. So that's not appropriate. They should be provided by an appropriate provider. A paraprofessional that does not, or a teacher assistant is there to assist, but they shouldn't be developing programming, and they shouldn't be a sole service provider. Now, some kids have on their service delivery grid have a teacher assistant or a paraprofessional on their service delivery grid, and that's fine because they're reinforcing the lessons learned, or they're more for accommodations. Maybe it's visual accommodations so that the child can access the environment. They really should be directed by someone like a special educator or a TVI, depending on what the service is. And is that provider doing it in individual, small group, and where is that provided? You know, the where is important, especially for kids with CVI. If it's a busy classroom in the back of a general ed busy classroom, then sometimes it's not appropriate. Sometimes they can't visually attend, or maybe they're distracted by noises. So knowing where it is important. Okay, so this is an example of one kiddo goal example and objectives. Now, all right, so let me tell you that goals are never perfect. They're never going to be written perfectly. They're never going to, we want them to be as measurable as possible and really make sense to the team that's providing them. And make sure that we can track the progress. So you have that current performance that I showed you earlier, and then you have the overall goal and the objectives. Sometimes they're benchmarks, depends on what district you are in. Sometimes these look sometimes different where, you know, they're more than, like some of these objectives might be goals areas, you know, but you get the idea. You get the idea what it should look like. So this is an overarching goal, it's the top, and then the objectives underneath how to meet that overarching goal. Now, we just want to make sure that we feel confident enough that the goals are somewhat appropriate. I wouldn't always, to me, the most important thing is really the services and tracking progress. So we want to make sure that we know where the child is starting, and then we know where they end up. So this is another example of a goal for a child with CVI. I picked these two out because I thought they were a little bit different and very much for kids that have CVI, but it really depends. Maybe you have an older student. These were two younger students. Maybe you have an older student that's reading. That the goal might be a reading goal with CVI embedded in that. It really depends on where their child, again, is currently, and then where they're going to end up. All right, so those are the goals and the objectives. Oh, I threw this goal in here because this was an object calendar system goal. And this has the overarching goal again, and then these are the benchmarks that would talk about how to use for this student who's using an object calendar system and what their needs are and how they were going to be tracked by that. All right. So let's talk about accommodations, because that really comes in next. And I think there's a few questions prior about accommodations. So I pulled some accommodations. There's 2 pages here from the list I have for my kids that have CVI that I work with. Again, some of these are very specific to the students. So the accommodations should be very specific to the student, but these are, you get some ideas of them. And again, the accommodations, so sometimes because the CVI accommodations, I would actually encourage you to do this, or encourage you to ask your district, and I wish I put a slide up like this. Sometimes the accommodations page, especially for kids with CVI, gets very long. And then I worry about like general educators or special educators or related service folks like PTs and SLPs or special teachers not following them. So chunking them into CVI accommodations can be really helpful sometimes in, okay, so these are the ones that are for the child's CVI, instead of kind of putting them all in the mix with like general accommodations for the classroom, like they have to sit close, or they circle back for understanding, or those things. I would make sure that they're chunked all together in the accommodations. Here are a few others. And again, these are very specific to the 2, I pulled these from a few different students, but you can see that they are really well written. But again, I would really chunk them to being CVI accommodations. And then progress monitoring. How do we know that a kiddo is making progress? So this is really important to talk about at the meeting. Like what kind of data are you going to collect? Is it informal or is it formal data? Are you doing informal or formal assessments? What measures? So these are really important. Again, at the beginning, we need to know where we're starting. We need to know how it's going to be assessed. So then we know where we're going to end up. Because we don't want to get to the end of an IEP period and then kind of be wondering if the child's been making progress or not, right? So we want it to be really clear of how we're going to mark that progress. What does it look like when the child has achieved the benchmark? Is it generalized across all areas? Is it in general education and special education? Is it at home? And what does it look like if, I like this question too. Oops, I'm sorry. I like this last question too, is like, what does it look like if it's not achieved? What does the benchmark or objective or a whole goal look like if it's not achieved? Because at least you're having the conversation, you're understanding the playing field. You're both on the same, you're having the same conversation. Oftentimes I come into meetings and the parents are talking over here, like they're having their own conversation, the school is having their own conversation. Yeah, they're talking together, but they're not talking about the same thing. So really understanding where you're starting is really important, and how that the benchmarks and objectives are going to be monitored. So services drive placement. This is also really important. Like I said, I've been in so many meetings that either the school or the parents want to talk about placement at the beginning of the meeting. Like, we get this placement, that's going to be really important. However, like if you don't go through this process, you don't actually know what placement is appropriate. You may know as a parent. Most parents know what placement is appropriate. However, you need everyone on board to be able to make that decision together. And we could talk a little bit about whether or not what to do if we don't have the same idea. So I think this is really important. So it's a placement in a general ed class. So it doesn't need to be a private, institution, private school, special ed school. Are the services going to be in general ed? That's, a placement decision. What does the student get from this placement? Do they get peers? Peers are really important to all students. What are they learning? What are they learning? Like, what's the outcome? And this is important. Like, and this kind of goes to the second bullet point too, is what I have a family that I've been working with for a really long time that, the priority of the student was really driven by typical peers and being with typical peers. And the student got a lot of energy, a lot of learning from typical peers. And that was really appropriate for the student. And she was learning so much from them. So some students, because of their preferences, because of how they learn, really being in a general ed environment is really important to them, and really important to the family. Sometimes it doesn't work, and what they are learning is really important, because oftentimes I run into situations where kids are just sitting in the back of the classroom with a paraprofessional or teacher assistant, and they're not really learning. So this is an important question. What is appropriate for this student? So appropriate is really, so you're entitled, the law is really, you're entitled to the Chevy, not the Cadillac, for your appropriate education. So what's appropriate? It's really important to know what's appropriate for your student. And you can get that from a lot of different information, whether that's from private evaluations or school evaluations or talking to other parents. You'll get a good idea. If not, if what's being proposed is not appropriate, I think talking to other parents, looking for other placements is a really valuable tool, and you have that opportunity. Every parent does. So there's both federal and state law has procedural safeguards for families and districts. So the prior written notice, I know there was a question about that earlier, and I'll kind of talk about that after, because that seems like a real particular situation. I want to bring up that actual question. So the prior written notice really alerts the family to the meeting and the topic, or it should. Sometimes I get prior written notices and I'm like, I don't even, from parents, and I'm like, I don't even know. So we'll have to ask, what are we meeting about? If we didn't know that it's an annual review or there's testing, like, it's really important for us to know ahead of time so we can think about it and we can talk about it. Prior written notice is also what in it, these show up differently, different topics on prior written notices. What are the actions the school district will take? So will they act or will they not act is part of prior written notice. So if you've asked the school district to do something and they don't agree, then they should be putting that in writing to you. Prior written notice, depending on your state, could be a description of the evaluations and assessments. I always like a description of the evaluations and assessments. It doesn't necessarily mean that those are the only evaluations or assessments that I want a school district to do. I often ask the school district to give me an idea of what they're going to do, but I'm not going to necessarily hold them to particular tests because I want to make sure that the evaluator has the opportunity to test however they see fit. You have the right to have access to your child's educational file. I wouldn't ask for this on a regular basis, but if you had, if you were going to file for due process and you were hiring an attorney to file for due process, that's part of the process. So you have access to that anytime. You can make administrative complaints. These are usually about compliance around the IEP. So right now I'm writing an administrative complaint because the school district's been hiding that they don't have a special educator on staff. And we just found out, mom just found out indirectly. And so we need an investigation to be done by the state. So mediation is another avenue if you have a dispute. If you have a dispute with the district, both you and the district need to agree to mediation. I was, again, I don't like to assume why we're going to mediation. I don't like to assume that the school district knows why we're going to mediation. So if I was working with a family that had a dispute with the district and they wanted to mediate, I would reach out to the mediator and tell them exactly what the dispute was about, because the mediation is not a IEP meeting. It's really targeted to that one dispute. And let me give you an example. Let's say the dispute is about placement. The school district wants to place your child one place and you want them to be placed somewhere else. So we don't want to talk about anything else. We don't want to be sidetracked. We want to talk about placement. We don't want to talk about goals. We don't want to talk about services. And if the school district, if that's the dispute, is placement, if the school district agrees to mediate, that you want them to come to the mediation thinking that's what you're going to talk about. You don't want to get them in mediation and they're like, we don't want to talk about placement. We think our placement is appropriate. You don't want to waste time or money going to mediation. Mediation is free to everyone. However, oftentimes I participate in mediation. Sometimes attorneys do. It's a place to problem solve outside the IEP process that is confidential, and you can have a settlement agreement come out of mediation, and sometimes that happens. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes you don't agree. Mediation is not, if two parties agree to mediation, it's not always that you come out with a agreement. But oftentimes, if people understand what they're mediating about and there's some flexibility on both sides, oftentimes there is a settlement agreement. And those are typically confidential. You cannot tell anyone, your neighbor, your friends, and it's binding. And then due process is a court hearing. So I urge parents not to do due process on their own. They really need an attorney. I do not do due process hearings as an advocate. I work with a number of attorneys that litigate I do not litigate. It is a difficult process. It's not something that most families want to go through, but oftentimes it's their only option. The school district isn't being reasonable. The students' needs aren't being met. And, you know, I would go in with a clear understanding that most times the cases are, if they go all the way through due process, you can file for due process and you can settle. Just so you know, you can file for due process, you could withdraw your complaint. You can file for due process and settle with the district. It doesn't always end up in a hearing decision by a hearing officer. But if it does go all the way, oftentimes parents lose. School districts have, if they think their case is strong, they have unlimited resources for attorney fees, experts. So really, case building is something I do with attorneys all the time, making sure the case is so strong that the school district wants to settle it. I've not had a case go through hearing. I've definitely helped attorneys and helped them write hearing requests and filed them. However, all my cases have settled because the strength of the case really matters. If you go through all the way to hearing, go through to a decision, and even some cases, I should just back up, some cases you start the hearing, the actual hearing with a hearing officer, and then school districts want to settle like within that, within the hearing. So it's a legal process that is very, very difficult on families and very hard and expensive. If you do prevail, meaning you win, at least in the states that I work in, I do not know all the state laws, you can recoup your attorney fees, but nothing else. No other expert fees, no fees of mine. So it is something to really consider and really understand your state, whether hearings go towards the school district often or go towards parents. But my analysis of most states, they are in favor of school districts. So what should you prepare for? Well, first, you should read everything that's sent home to you. I know it's really hard, and oftentimes, we're all really busy, but it's really, really important that you read the evaluations, the tests, the IEP, the progress reports, highlight areas of concern that you may have, write down your concerns and questions prior to the meeting. I think those are really, really important, like writing down your concerns and questions, because especially in this Zoom platform, it can be really difficult to keep all those pieces in your head and get all your questions and concerns answered. So ask to speak. If you're speaking about speech and the speech pathologist isn't at the meeting, make sure you talk to them directly. Sometimes they'll, at last minute, someone will be sick, and unless it's really critical, like a primary teacher, whether it's a general educator or a special educator, someone that knows your student really, really well, I would say do the IEP meeting. Don't cancel it because it's really hard to schedule them, especially this time of year. And then follow up with your questions afterwards to the person that knows how to answer them. And I also really love, here in Massachusetts, we have a parent concerns section in our IEP. Not all states have it, but you can still write it. And even if you don't have a parent concern section, give some feedback, give the concerns. And oftentimes this parent statement or parent feedback I think, have a rough outline that you submit to the school, and then you can always follow up with an after the meeting. You may have more concerns after the meeting than you had prior to the meeting, so you can follow up afterwards. Some costly pitfalls to avoid. Review all your outside evaluations before giving it to the school. I have seen parents that aren't working with me and then end up with me that have given the school evaluations that have wrong information about the kid. It's in their school file. We can't go back. Once it's submitted to the school, it's there, it's stuck. We can say it doesn't, we can send a letter saying this is not accurate, but just make sure everything is accurate. Know their end goals and know your end goals. So what's the school like? What are they after? Like, do they want to keep your kid in general ed? Do you want to not have them in general? Do you want your kid in general ed and they don't? Understand that. Try to dig deep. Be present at the meeting. Now, this is the hardest thing as a parent. I think I know I struggle with that as a parent. I have 3 boys, 2 with disabilities, and IEP meetings can be exhausting and emotional. If you cannot be present, because I know that sometimes, especially early on when my kids were younger, I might not have been as present as I would like, because it's hard to hear these things about your kids. Sometimes it's hard to like really understand them. It's hard, it's emotional. And so when it's emotional, you start shutting down. It's just human nature. And so making sure that you have someone there that can really help you stay focused, or even take a break if you need to. Ask lots of questions. If you don't know, don't be afraid to ask. What does that mean? Like, all the time, I ask so many questions. Like, tell me more about that is my favorite thing to say. What do you think about that? Because I want to hear what they think. I want to hear if I feel confident in how they're teaching a kid. Like, tell me how you would do that. My all-time favorite is, tell me what your classroom looks like. And if someone is enthusiastic and they're going through the day and the teacher's telling you all about their classroom and how they interact with kids, I'm more confident in that teacher than the teacher that looks at me and says, like, why is this person asking me this question? Right? If you're an educator that loves teaching kids, you should be wanting this question. You should be eager to answer it. Again, keep records. I encourage everyone to email. Some phone conversations could happen, but just follow up with an email like, okay, we all on the same page about this. This is what we discussed, making sure, don't make assumptions. I think that parents sometimes, I think everyone sometimes, so I'm not going to say parents make assumptions. And I think that can be a real problem. So if we know the information, like I ask a lot of questions. Create a paper trail and always be respectful. I think that when parents or educators, because I've seen it, or SPED directors are not respectful, I think it really, the relationship degrades, and it's not good for the kid. Okay, I think this last one. Know the rules of the game. Who's at the meeting? Request a sign-in sheet. Know who's making decisions. Who's making decisions about your kid? Like, I know it should be the LEA, but sometimes it's not. Understand the process and work within the law. That's the way it is. Yes, it's upside down world. I always say special education is upside down world. It doesn't make any sense. It's like, but it's there. It's what we got to work with. We can't really change it right now without a lot of hard work. And this is hard enough. So work within the process, understand it, try to, be respectful as you're doing it. And here we are. Questions? I'm going to stop. Do you want me to stop sharing?
Yeah. Thank you, Angela. Oh my goodness. You just walked us through it. Thank you so much.
That was kind of exhausting. So anyone has
There's been a
questions?
lot of questions and comments and parents, commenting on each other's questions and comments. So
Okay.
a lively bunch. So it's exciting. Let's start with some that come up live here. And let's see. So here's a question about accommodations and ones for standardized tests. My district doesn't want to add accommodations that cannot be implemented in standardized tests. Can you have 2 lists, one for every day and one for testing?
Yes, you absolutely can. And you always, like, I don't think I ever see an IEP that doesn't have both listed, because there's certain things in the classroom that's not during testing situations that a kid would need. So absolutely, I would push back on that and say these accommodations are required for my student to participate and access the curriculum. That's the language you really want. That's the access point.
Yeah, great. So another question about, let me just go into it. Besides 100% trust, how do you know if your child is getting the exact amount of services per week that is outlined in the IEP? Do you recommend writing in periodic check-ins into the IEP?
Yeah. Okay, super hard one. Yeah. I go, so there's a trust jar. This is my imaginary trust jar. And and sometimes the trust is really low and sometimes it's really high. So we need different things for different periods of trust. So this is really difficult. Yes. So I write into the IEP whatever is needed for the student. So I always have something about progress monitoring. When we were going back in my slideshow, it was, know what the progress monitoring is going to be. So you understand what that looks like. Like, is it monthly? Is it every 6 weeks? Is it with report cards? And you can disagree and still say, well, I disagree with that. I really need more information. And what does that look like? Sometimes it's informal. Now, whether or not a kid is getting services, it should really be documented. I run into this sometimes. I told you a little bit about the special educator that's no longer with the school district, and now we're filing administrative complaint. Wow. If that is the case, you can certainly file an administrative complaint with evidence and have the state investigate. First, I would start with, can you give me a schedule? Asking for your kid's schedule is something that you can do. That has the related services on there. Start with that. I would start with, talking to the classroom teacher. Do they receive their services every week? Sometimes they don't receive them the same time because there may be a school event. Pre-COVID, they would have assemblies and things like that, or field trips. So, kind of do a little digging. I would say that usually classroom teachers privately give up a lot of information to parents. Side conversations, not through email, but that's the one place you want to have side conversations. Yeah. And don't throw that teacher under the bus. Then you have to figure out how to then, you want that teacher to keep on talking to you. Schools are political places, even more so than anywhere else. Yeah. And you want that teacher to keep on giving you information. So you definitely don't want to say, I heard from Mrs. X, Y, and Z that, Johnny's not getting his TVI. So then you have to figure out how you're going to use the information. Then you go to the administration and ask for the records of service. But I would definitely not throw general ed or special ed teachers under the bus because they don't have any real say in anything anyway. So,
yeah. Along those lines, there was a question submitted prior about parent input. And this is something that I experienced in the past. how can parents get teams to embrace and use the parents' input? How can we actually help foster collaboration with the team? And like, how can we avoid team members becoming defensive? Because CVI parents, we learn a lot because we have to, and we have a lot of input. And especially after this year of COVID and remote
Yeah.
learning, we've gained a lot of data and observation about our kids. So how can we get teams to see our input in a good way and actually use it and apply it in school without them putting the walls up?
Great question. It does not always happen successfully with every person.
Yeah.
It really depends on the receiving end.
Mm-hmm.
If they are open and they have they have confidence about themselves as a teacher and a learner. My experience, when folks put up walls, they're probably really insecure about what they know. Yeah. So then that puts up red flags, whether it's an appropriate placement. And then I start thinking, well, is this a good idea for this kid to be here? So, going back to your question. So there's my thought process. But sometimes we have to kind of work with where we are at. So a couple suggestions: go to the person privately, maybe not in the meeting, and say, I really want to collaborate with you. Sometimes they're willing to have like a parent consult. I really want to collaborate. Here are some ideas that are really working at home. I think they may be helpful at school. Can I give you some ideas? And really present it in that way of not like you don't know what you're doing, but here's some ideas that have worked for us. And especially capitalize on this COVID period. Every parent has become an expert. Every parent has become a teacher and an expert and everything. So capitalize on this. Say, we really found this useful when Johnny was at home doing remote school. Like, we really want this carried over in the school. Those don't always have to be IEP discussions or team meeting discussions. And I think that sometimes, again, it's a workplace. It's if you put that person, you put yourself in that person's shoes, you wouldn't want to be called out in front of your peers either. Mm-hmm. Some people take that really well, some other people don't. I think knowing the audience. I think also what I just want to mention, because I think it comes along the lines of culture, school culture, going to the top, going to your principal and saying, I really want to collaborate. This worked really well for a family that I have here in Massachusetts that I work with. And their student is in general ed, older student, and they really noticed the high school wasn't a really inclusive place for her. Mm-hmm. And they wanted to really brainstorm and collaborate about the high school culture. And they did that. And they had some really great conversations with the principal, and then how is that going to trickle down to everyone else? Mm-hmm. So I think there's a lot of different ways to approach it. But first start one-on-one, I think.
Yeah. That's good. That's really good. It's a big one.
It's a big one.
All right. So I have this big question. I hope you can make sense of it. Let's see. So a parent asked, does it make sense that a student would be asked to withdraw, but the school district would still provide education-related services and yet not have to adhere to the IEP?
Well, sometimes. So you want to be very careful about this.
Okay.
You want to have an attorney, at least an advocate that's savvy with settlement agreements. You want a settlement agreement. You do not want to withdraw your student or graduate them. So this often happens when a student is graduation age, but not 22, and they're asked to withdraw. They are entitled, every student that's under special education is entitled to an education until they either graduate, withdraw, or turn 22. Mm-hmm. So yes, it's sometimes in a settlement agreement, a student is asked, it's very highly unusual. Okay, so this is like a few of my settlement agreements over the many years that I've been practicing. So rare, very rare. I think I've had like a handful that in order to get a placement often, so an out of district placement, the district agrees to pay for that placement. However, the student needs to withdraw. But this is written very particularly by by an attorney and the school district attorney. I think it's worth spending the money on a private attorney that works with only parents that is practices in special education law. So this actually opens up like one of the things that if you need an attorney for special education, you need someone that's practicing in special education law in your state, that's licensed in your state. I have seen parents use attorneys or heard about from other folks use attorneys that don't specialize in special education law. It's a very, very, very nuanced law. You cannot use your real estate attorney. You cannot use a tax attorney. You need a special education attorney. But that's what I would suggest. And if they're at the point with asking you to withdraw and they're giving you some sort, you want that written out, like exactly what that looks like to protect you and your child.
I wish it wasn't this hard.
It is. I say every day, Rachel, I say, please, I want to work myself out of a job. Like I want it to be like general ed students. You just, put your kid on the bus, they go to school and they come home and you're very confident that they're learning something, right? How many general ed parents go, I don't think you learned anything today. I don't know what you learned. I don't understand. I want the laws to get so much better in every state federally. I want kids to be able to access appropriate education and make progress wherever they're at. And I don't have to be involved. And I could go garden
one day
or do something else.
Someday.
No, I don't think so. I'm like,
I know. Really? Okay, we're gonna keep going forward.
It's doom and gloom. Let's move forward.
So during your presentation, you mentioned, kids with CVI who are kind of operating within grade level-ish. It's really hard to get all the services and accommodations that they need. And so a parent was just saying, this is my exact issue. And, what's the best way to advocate for this?
Okay, so they're within grade level or that range of grade level.
Low average, yeah.
And are they on an IEP?
Yeah. Well,
they are.
I don't know, actually.
Okay. I'm going to assume they're on an IEP.
Okay.
So how can they have the services or the accommodations that they need within general ed? Make sure they're in the IEP.
Yeah.
Once it's in the IEP, then it's a legally binding agreement between the parent and the school district, and they have to follow it.
Yeah.
Even in general ed. I know this was a question that came up earlier. Like accommodations, once they're in the IEP, if they're not followed, they're a procedural violation and you can file a complaint with the state. I mean, school districts don't love that, and parents, I don't like filing complaints against states, with the state against the district. That's like my least favorite thing to do. So you just push them to follow them. Like, are they being used? Let me show me. Have someone go observe. You can go observe. See if they're being used. You might not see them all being used. Might be the situation. But if they're in the IEP, they need to be filed. That's bottom line. Yeah. No matter. But if they're not in the IEP, then they're not going to, then you don't have any leg to stand on. So first you have to break it down to getting it in the IEP.
And that could be the hard part right there too for families.
That could be the hard part.
Yeah.
You have to show need.
Yeah. Is that where assessment comes in?
Assessment comes in, experts, your TBI, special educator comes in. And even if this kiddo is on a 504, those accommodations are legally binding too.
Right.
Accommodations level the playing field. So if they need, so it's a little bit a better visual with the ramp like situation. If someone needs a ramp to get in the school building, because they're in a wheelchair or they use a walker or they have, mobility issues, so it's a little bit visually, so use that example. This is my kid's ramp.
Yeah.
That level the playing field. Right. So 504 or IEP.
And then what if you have a school team that doesn't have the knowledge of CVI, the comprehensive knowledge to be able to adequately assess your kid and then even know how to provide the accommodations?
So then you ask, and this is a perfect time for this. Then you ask for an expert. And because we are now so used to this platform of folks, I have experts that have gotten video samples of kids in therapy sessions or in the classroom and written reports about the kid. They interview the teacher, they interview the parents, they interview, service providers. They get a good picture, and then the person, whether it's a TBI or, and sometimes it's a special educator, that has real experience working with kids that have visual impairment and CVI. So I wouldn't necessarily say that it's always a TBI, but if this is a digital world, a lot of my observations of kids are not being done in person right now because of COVID. And so I think this is a great opportunity. Ask your district to get expertise because the law is really clear. They have to evaluate all suspected disabilities. So you can say, this is a suspected disability. We need to have evaluations in this, and we need someone qualified. Now, if they bring in someone that isn't qualified, this often happens. Let's say the TBI doesn't understand CVI, they don't have no experience. Right. Then you disagree in writing again, please, and say you don't agree with this. There's not much you can do after that until they present their report. And you say, well, this report isn't accurate because this person doesn't have the qualifications, and you ask for an independent evaluation paid for by the district. And again, it depends on the state. It depends on the district. State rules around independent evaluations are different in every state, but that's how I would go about it. And this is a perfect opportunity. A lot of evaluators are doing evaluations over Zoom, and you could have an evaluator from Massachusetts be evaluating a kid in California, and it's unheard of. So
it has opened up a lot of doors. That's the truth.
It has opened up a lot of doors. You can really look for expertise. And as a parent, I would look for those people. I would present them to the team, say, hey, this person's really excellent. They're fabulous. We got this information from Rachel, or you get it from me. And they can say, well, no, thanks. But oftentimes they might consider it. If you don't ask, you don't know.
Right. Always ask. Good point. Really quick question about signing the IEP. Can I take the IEP home and read through completely before signing?
Always.
Always. Good.
Not every state requires a signature.
Right.
So that can be a little tricky, but if your state requires a signature, never sign it at the IEP meeting. You have no idea what's in it. I don't care how fast you read.
Right.
It's exhausting process. Take it home.
Yeah.
Give it a couple days. Sleep on it.
Yeah, I got to read it multiple times to make sure I don't want to miss anything. Because once you
and make sure it's accurate. I mean, that's the other thing is people are writing a lot. They write a lot of IEPs. Let's make sure it's about your kid.
Yeah. No, it's
but always take it home. Never sign it in the meeting.
And for states, I know when we were in Maryland, they didn't ask, we only had to sign it once, the very first IEP, and then you didn't sign it again.
Yeah, some states you don't even have to sign it at all. And I would have to say like, so that gives you no opportunity to disagree.
Right.
And so one of the strategic, so in Massachusetts, I kind of use this everywhere. It's because I work with families in lots of different states, especially with this nice Zoom meetings now. So I would say so in Massachusetts, I use this format for anywhere that doesn't have the opportunity to sign and disagree with the IEP. So here we can fully reject the IEP, we can partially reject the IEP, or we can fully accept the IEP. Well, I usually practice in the partial reject area. And even in places that don't require a signature, if you reject certain things in that IEP, write a letter. These are the things we reject. We reject, and I often am writing letters for parents that reject the things that are missing. So that going back to that person, that if those accommodations, CBI accommodations aren't in the IEP, reject the fact that they're not in the IEP, and write a letter. And say that word. I reject the fact that this is not in the IEP. So, okay, that wasn't very quick. Sorry.
No, it was a good one. That's a great one. Great answer. Let's see, more questions coming in. What if the school refuses to accept CVI as a diagnosis, as a determination for legally blindness and diagnosis? The IEP is written for ocular issues, but the student is not ocular blind.
Disagree with it.
Just
disagree with it. You just have to take it all the, if they're not, so the school district has to, they have to evaluate all suspected disabilities. Go back to that. Okay. And if it makes sense, go to the federal law, because that's really clear. And then if they're not, you have an administrative complaint there. But first, write a letter saying you disagree, and these are the reasons why, and outline those reasons.
Yeah. Lots of letter writing.
Lots of letter. I do a lot of letter writing. I do a lot of reading and letter writing.
Yep.
Okay.
Here we go. Next question. What types of continuing education is required for special ed directors? Oh, that's a bold question. Vision was consistently left off all paperwork, consent to eval, IEP drafts, etc. A field cut and possible CVI is enough. I'm concerned for other parents who don't know better. Is that question clear?
No, not really, but I'll answer the first part of it, and then I'll go to the second part of it, I think. So special ed directors, team chair. So special ed director is the person, the administrator, like at the very top, like under the superintendent. So they usually work under the superintendent, direct supervisor to the superintendent. In big school districts, that person, you're never going to see them. And then they have like smaller SPED directors throughout, that govern a certain number of schools. So to be a special ed director, I've seen them not be special educators, which is most concerning.
Yes.
Oftentimes they're attorneys, like sometimes they are, not often. Sometimes they're attorneys, which I always I question, so there's supposed to be some professional development for special ed directors. It really depends on the state. I don't know all the state requirements. Sometimes I see attorneys, and that's like the worst, I think. That's the worst, because they're not in it for the kids. They're not.
Like I said, this is about the kids.
So then I'll tackle the second part. If things are left out, your parent feedback is really important, or that parent letter, and just take it chunk by chunk. Start from the beginning. Okay, this is what's missing.
Yeah.
Please add it to the IEP. I mean, just add this to the IEP. Sometimes this parent input is really long. Sometimes it's not. But if in this situation, I would imagine it would be a very long document. that you're cutting and pasting from evaluations that either the school has done or outside evaluations, and you're cutting and pasting what's needed to be in the IEP.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You're really, really detailed and specific.
Detailed and really then also, if it's your words, if you're writing it, refer to why. Like, is it because of it's a recommendation from a school provider or an outside provider? Unfortunately, parents aren't really looked at as experts. I think that's changing tide in this COVID era. I hope that we keep on going, but I do worry that we're going to swing back to parents don't know anything, which is impossible.
Yeah, I just got a note that the special director is a small district and they were the IEP team lead.
That can be really, really difficult. Small districts with not a lot of resources within the district can be very difficult. And if there's no one else to go to above them, you try this feedback, try your parent feedback, be really detailed of what you want in the IEP. If that doesn't happen, then go to the superintendent and talk to them. You can file a complaint. Small districts are tough though for kids with CVI. It's tough for kids with disabilities often, but small district can be tough. And if there isn't resources, meaning money, it can really not be a great place to be in.
Okay, are you still good for time? We got more questions.
I got time.
Great.
Good.
Okay, so talking about prior written notice requests.
Okay.
And submitting many prior written notice requests to our, I think one of my kids is knocking at the door. All right, let me start again. I've been submitting my many prior written notice requests to our IEP team. Is it customary that an IEP team meeting needs to be held to discuss each request? What are the best practices for requesting a PRN? What is a reasonable response time for the school to answer? If the parent disagrees,
someone's being really polite.
If the parent disagrees with the decision, should the parent write a rebuttal? Did you get all those questions?
Yeah. So I would try to be efficient. If you have a lot of requests, put them into one and say, all right, I want to meet about all these things. Do they have to write you in return for every request? I would say yes, but I would try to be really succinct. I wouldn't be writing a request. I would really put them all into one letter, ask for a meeting to talk about all your concerns. And then ask for a private written notice afterwards of how they're going to act, whether they're going to act or not, and how they're going to act, and have it all written down. Now, I think this is a good area to have a discussion. Now, perspective, so their perspective and your perspective might be totally different about the meeting and how that goes and how it's written in a private written notice. So yes, you want to respond if you have a different take on how things went in that meeting or that there's errors in that. Recently, we got a prior written notice that said the kid prefers AAC device over sign language, which kind of is a sticking point. And we had to write a rebuttal that said the kid actually really prefers sign. And they use their AC device because they're using total communication. So if things are inaccurate or your perception is different than theirs, please clarify. And that becomes part of, they're not going to change their prior written notice. So if you're looking for them to change it, they're not going to do that. That's something that doesn't matter. But what matters is that you have a paper trail.
I see. Okay. All right, more questions. Let's see. How do you find a state-specific advocate who also has knowledge of CVI deafblindness?
Well, that's really tricky. I have a lot of cases for kids that are deafblind that also have CVI. you know. I think that's a really tricky area. Not a lot of advocates have experience with kids that are deafblind. And not so much the CVI piece, but the deafblind piece. I think it's really hard. I could try to reach out to folks. You know, you can email me, you can give my email and they can email me directly, and I would have to know what state they're in. But it's not that easy. They're low incident deaf blindness.
I hate that term, low incidence.
Yeah. It's just a lot of people just aren't practiced, right? Like if you're not doing it every day, you want someone that really understands the disability, really understands what the needs are. Because if they don't understand it, then it's going to be very difficult to navigate. And the problem being is that even a lot of deafblind kids, you know, so kids with CVI often aren't identified, right? Kids that have deaf blindness aren't identified very often. Oftentimes, I work with a lot of kids with deaf blindness. This is like a pet peeve of mine, and I'll just get it out there. There's a category that says deaf blind, federal category, disability category. It is not two things. You don't have deafness and visual impairment. Like, there is actually a category. And as school district after school district just argue with me about the categorization of a kid. Well, they're deaf and they have a vision impairment. Well, that means they're deaf blind. Well, and they'll just argue and argue and argue. So really, because then you're paying for a deafblind expert to come in and help shape the program, and there's just no one. There's just no one. It's really, really hard to find, and so it's a huge problem. But feel free to reach out, and I'll try to steer you in the right direction. But I want to go back to the question prior, because something popped into my mind that I tell folks all the time. So this prior written notice thing, like, it's not about being right. You're never going to get a school district to say, "Oh yeah, you were right. You're right. We're wrong." That's not going to happen. It will never, ever happen. It won't even happen at hearing. What is important is your child gets what they need. So staying focused on that need and not being right, because I know I'm a parent. I want to be right.
Yeah.
I want people to listen to me. Yeah. It doesn't work. Never seen it. Never seen the school district come back and say, "Oh yeah, we're really sorry. We've been doing this all wrong." Like, nope, not happen. Even if they are. Yeah.
Okay. Let me just make sure I haven't missed any questions. Okay. So how do we know if our child should be in general ed or small class pullout? It's a pretty broad question. It's all based on.
Well, so I think it's based on a lot of factors. Can they access the curriculum in general ed? Overarching. Are they just sitting there and they're not getting anything out of it? That's really important to know. If they can't access it for whatever reason, maybe they need a different curriculum, or maybe they get too distracted visually or auditorily or whatever else, internally distracted. They then, having a small group is really important. Even if they're learning general ed, if they're following the general ed curriculum, but just they can't access it because there's too many kids or it's moving too quickly. Some kids, if you don't have access to all your vision and your hearing, one or the other or both, it is very hard to keep up with a general ed class. Even if you have the cognitive ability, it is very hard. I would say that a kid with CVI would at least need a special educator in the class with them, like a co-taught special educator, general educator in the class to be able to accommodate, make sure that they circle back for understanding. I don't love taking kids out of general ed. I don't love putting kids separate, but I also don't love kids not learning.
Yeah.
Their time is valuable.
Mm-hmm.
Kids that have CVI or have other disabilities, their time is even more valuable. They need to optimize every learning opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
And in general ed, that may not happen.
Yeah. I mean,
so
it should be flexible,
it's a real tough call. Like, yeah. So there are flexible models like that, right? Like, and there are schools that would do like have a section of the classroom or in the hallway even, that I've seen some nice setups. I think those are the schools that really are creative about learning.
You have to be.
Yeah, and not all schools think about learning like this. I think maybe we're getting to a place where we're thinking differently. I really hope that COVID has made us think differently about education. But I think in general, if your kid isn't learning anything, a number of years ago, I had a child with low cognition, intellectual impairment, sitting in a high school biology class. How is that useful? I asked the team, how is that useful for her? Like, what is she getting out of this? She's sitting with a paraprofessional in the back of the room. What kind of vocabulary? The vocabulary is over her head. They were like, well, she's with her peers. I'm like, well, what peers?
Yeah.
How is she interacting with them?
Meaningful.
Yeah. So that meaningful education, I think I'm always going back to that word meaningful. How is this meaningful?
Yeah.
How is my kid accessing it? Tell me about that.
Yeah.
I mean, asking those questions to the teachers are really important, and you'll get a real good sense, or ask for an observation. Even in these times, we're doing Zoom observations all the time, and you'll get a good sense if your kid is learning or
not. Okay. There was a parent whose child is going to be transitioning out of, IFSP or preschool into kindergarten. What are some, what should she look for? What should she prioritize with this big transition?
It's a big transition.
Oh, it's a hard one for me.
It's a hard one for parents because preschool is like, even regular general ed preschool is really family oriented. It's really child-centered.
Yeah.
Family-oriented. We're all like working together. It's always
so much collaboration. Yeah.
There's so much collaboration. I do not know why this hasn't trickled over to K through 12 or K through 22. It is crazy to me. That is the biggest shocker that I let folks know about, parents know about. Like, it's really difficult. The culture is much different. So that can be really, really tricky for parents to understand. I think that like the physical transition is really important. Like having kids go into the classroom when no other kids are there. So they really, with visual impairments too, giving them enough time to explore the classroom without other students there. Really important. In that time, you will have a nice conversation with the teacher and really establish that relationship. And really establish that communication, how that's going to happen. I think those are really the key pieces. Making sure your IEP is appropriate for kindergarten, because preschool IEPs look a lot different. I always, with any transition, ask for a meeting 4 to 6 weeks into the school year, because 4 to 6 weeks is a good amount of time that the teacher's going to the providers are going to understand the kiddo, really understand what they need. And oftentimes that the IEP needs to be changed at that point to reflect what a child needs in that environment. But I think the physical transition of having the kid go in is just so important for any kid that has a visual impairment, either CVI, ocular, both, because they need to understand the layout. They need to understand, and also having the TBI and the O&M go in prior, making sure there's anything that needs to be adapted for the student is adapted before they go in. So I would ask for like going in maybe the end of school, just so you can picture the environment, and then definitely there's usually a couple days before the kids start that teachers are setting up and things like that. I would request that.
That's good. That's good. I think we've captured most of them.
Okay.
I want to be cognizant of your time. So thank you. Oh, there's one more. Are you accepting new clients is a question.
Well, okay. So I have a little like weakness for CVI families and deafblind families. I have a little like, I don't know. I just feel like kind of protective of all of you and just like, oh, I'll just take you under my wing. And so reach out. let's see if it would work together well, and let's see what your needs are. And it's a whole lot easier for me in this environment because I don't have to travel as much, so I can take on more clients. Let's see where
being so protective of us. It's important that folks that they're looking out for CVI parents in a way.
Well, I just feel like that this is so there's so much information out there, right? The school districts don't understand it. They're not up to speed. They don't get it. And I don't know how I became an expert in this area. I mean, I do know because Ellen Maisel and Dr. Susan Bruce and all these amazing people that came into my world, and I've just learned so much from them. And then I just become a little protective of having parents come to me that have worked with other people that just don't understand it.
Yeah.
And so.
And you get that, there's so much that we're dealing with, and then we have to deal with the IEP process, and it's just like one more trauma. It's just
it is one more trauma. It is serious trauma, and it's also something that I really wish that no one needed to go through. Yeah. It is not for the faint of heart. It is already hard to parent. It's already hard to live and manage everything that we manage on a daily basis. It is very hard when your child is not typically developing. However that looks, it is very hard. And there's lots of trauma. And it's not recognized by the school district. It's just like overlooked. Unless that parent has a kid that's not typical, that teacher doesn't understand. They just don't get it. They just don't understand what your daily life is. I help navigate the system, kind of take some pressure off of families. It's just difficult.
It's really difficult. It's like, I almost want, like, we're already in the space of vulnerability all the time with our kids. Just join us, like, be vulnerable with me. Let's just figure this out together. And it's hard for a lot of people to get there.
It's really hard. And I this is like a whole different like topic, and I'm kind of digressing, but this is like the place where I spend a lot of time with families is just being really vulnerable. I say to them, you come to me, we talk about whatever you need to talk about, we get whatever we need to get done. But it's super tough. It's super tough. And I just wish that school districts understood that a lot more. And I try.
Yeah.
Even good school districts don't understand it. I mean, even school, like Henry's in a great place. Mm-hmm. I don't think they probably understand it to the extent they need to.
Some do.
It's difficult. Some do, some don't.
Yeah.
I think it's difficult. So.
Okay. Well.
Happy Friday night. This is like a really great conversation, right?
Talking. There's so much to explore here.
There's so much to explore, and also this is like fast and like upper level. I'm willing to come back whenever you want me to come back and talk. Even having some open forums are really helpful. I can kind of problem solve out loud. I don't want to like disclose exactly, I would be mindful that we want to protect people, but we can talk globally about issues
We
that
won't
folks may
record
have.
those and such. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Very
Oh,
helpful.
thank you. I'm so
Okay.
grateful for you. Thank you so much for your time and your
Oh,
expertise and everything. It's
so grateful for you.
here for us. It's
Yeah.
really important. I really appreciate you.
Well, I appreciate you too. And all of you out there. Happy weekend.
We made it. Bye, everyone. Take care.
Bye. Take care.
Thank you so much for watching this event brought to you by CVI Now here at Perkins School for the Blind. Go to cvinow.org to learn more.